Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America. And on behalf of our Chair, Betsy Smith, and our trustees and staff, welcome. Special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. And for those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the American literary tradition a vital part of the culture for readers and writers to discover and to rediscover. This evening's event marks publication of this book, Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day, A Bridge Too Far, number 318 in the Library of America series, edited by Rick Atkinson. The volume honors the 75th anniversaries of D-Day next month and Operation Market Garden in September, and it's made possible with publication support from the Florence Gould Foundation and Malcolm O'Hagan, and kept permanently in print with a gift from the Pritzker Military Library and Museum. I remember seeing the movie version of The Longest Day at a Saturday matinee in the town where I grew up. John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, and Robert Ryan starred as various officers commanding the D-Day invasion, but the scene that always stayed with me was of a lone paratrooper whose chute gets tangled in a church steeple in a town in Normandy. He hangs there, alone and terrified, watching his comrades shot down by German soldiers in the town square below, trying somehow to find the strength and wits to survive. The scene is taken directly from the book, and it illustrates two things about Cornelius Ryan's brilliantly told and compulsively readable World War II classics. The New Yorker war correspondent A.J. Liebling wrote, "Books about war fall into two classes, those about what it was like and those about what happened." Ryan, who covered the war for the Daily Telegraph, he flew on 14 bombing missions early in his career there, showed that you could actually do both. And he helped invent a new form of nonfiction narrative to do it. Epic events recreated scene by scene, weaving together stories and voices collected in hundreds of interviews he conducted with both military leaders and ordinary soldiers and civilians, the men and women, American, British, French, Dutch, German, who had been until then anonymous. The effect, as Rick Atkinson writes in his introduction to the volume, is at once panoramic and intimate. Its influence is everywhere now among narrative historians and documentary filmmakers. The new journalists of the 60s took credit for creating the nonfiction novel. Ryan's innovative narratives, without the self-conscious posturing, were there first and to probably greater transformative effect. And there's something else about the church steeple scene. Ryan's large subject is the size, majesty, and complex unfolding of some of the largest military operations ever undertaken. But his deep themes are fear, resilience, and the struggle for courage. None of these is a respecter of rank or persons. So in both form and in theme, that is, Ryan writes history with a democratic spirit, in homage to the bravery and suffering of people caught up and often ground up in the giant engine of war. There's a letter which Rick included in the volume that Ryan wrote to Peter Schwed, his editor at Simon & Schuster, and actually a member of this club for over 30 years. Ryan writes, "I'm doing my best to abide by a single rule of thumb, accuracy. Really, if nothing else, I hope The Longest Day will set the record straight. It may sound corny, but I think the men who died on both sides on D-Day deserve that much." He later said of the American troops he reported on during the war, "Among those brash, irreverent, confident soldiers, I found my spiritual home." Here tonight to talk to us about Ryan and his achievement is the editor of this definitive Library of America edition, another journalist turned narrative historian, Rick Atkinson, a brilliant historian and gifted writer. He actually writes like a dream, I would say. The rich, magnificent canvases of his books glint with thousands of evocative and telling details. Rick won a Pulitzer for national reporting in 1982 at the Kansas City Times. At the Washington Post, where he worked for 25 years, an investigative series he edited on police shootings in the District of Columbia received the 1999 Pulitzer for Public Service. His books include The Long Gray Line, A History of the West Point Class of 1966, Crusade, The Untold Story of the Persian Gulf War, In the Company of Soldiers, based on his embedded reporting from Iraq in 2003, and the acclaimed Liberation Trilogy, an epic history of World War II in Europe, which won a Pulitzer Prize for History. The first volume of his new Revolution Trilogy, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, is out this month. Please welcome Rick Atkinson.
Thanks for that, Max, and thanks for inviting me to be with you this evening. I'm grateful to be here. So, as a way of coming around to talk about the guest of honor tonight, the late, great Cornelius Ryan, I'd like us to imagine that we're not in New York in May of 2019, but rather in London, 75 years ago this month, on May 15th, 1944, at St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road. It's a Gothic building of red brick and terracotta, where Winston Churchill, George Patton, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, King George VI, and several dozen other American and British commanders have gathered to review the final secret plan for Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, which is to take place in several weeks. They met in an auditorium known as the Model Room, sitting on 9 rows of hard wooden benches, normally used by schoolboys. The poet John Milton had attended St. Paul's, among other English luminaries. Even in mid-May, it was cold as a meat locker in the Model Room because German bombs had broken all 700 windows at St. Paul's School, and many of the generals and admirals were bundled up in their overcoats. And on the floor of the cockpit of the auditorium, there was an enormous plaster of Paris relief map of the Normandy coast where the River Seine spills into the Atlantic at a scale of 6 inches to the mile. And as the plan was reviewed, a British brigadier wearing no-skid socks shuffled across the floor map with a pointer to indicate various locations on what in 3 weeks would become the most famous battlefield in the world. The beaches, for instance: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. And towns that no one had ever heard of outside of Normandy, but would soon become famous: St. Lo, Cherbourg, Caen, and over on the far edge of the map, Paris. The man running that conference is someone you know, Dwight David Eisenhower, in the spring of 1944. He's 53 years old. He's smoking 4 packs of Camels a day. His blood pressure is 176 over 110. That's stage 2 hypertensive. He's a 4-star general at the time of Normandy, but he's still in ascent. He's rocketing from lieutenant colonel to 5-star general in 42 months. It's an average of 6 months between promotions. President Roosevelt has selected him as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force because he is, as the president says, a natural leader with exceptional political instincts. He has a knack for getting along with the British, notwithstanding the Anglophobia that infests senior American ranks. Unlike most of his U.S. Army peers, he likes the British. He's adopted words like petrol and tiffin. It drives George Patton insane. He's also been chosen because he's got exceptional organizational gifts. He describes himself as chairman of the board. That's the phrase he uses, a corporate metaphor. Chairman of the largest martial enterprise in the Western world. Well, the immediate task at hand is to catapult an army across that ugly piece of water called the English Channel, which is how the U.S. Army official history describes it. And that alone was among the most complex undertakings in the history of warfare. The channel is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest, but for nearly 1,000 years, invading armies facing a hostile shore across the English Channel had found more grief than glory. One British planner suggested that the only solution was to tow the beaches over already assaulted. The U.S. Army War Department had even pondered tunneling under the seabed. A detailed study deemed that this was feasible. It would take 1 year, 15,000 miners to excavate 50,000 tons of spoil. Wiser heads questioned the, quote, strategic and functional complexities of that plan, such as the inconvenience of having the entire German 7th Army waiting for the first miner's head to pop out of the hole. The study was shelved. Eisenhower and his comrades had so many worries in Operation Overlord that those worries had their own acronym, Pinwe, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. For example, there was anxiety that German planes would disperse what were called radioactive poisons over England, and Geiger counters were stockpiled to test for radioactivity. There was anxiety that German planes would drop rats infected with bubonic plague, and bounties were offered for rat carcasses to test for plague. And of course, there was anxiety that Hitler would initiate chemical warfare. Mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxins. The Allies stockpiled 160,000 tons of retaliatory chemicals in Europe and the Mediterranean. Planners had drafted, with Eisenhower's approval, 2 secret target lists for chemical warfare in Normandy. One list tried to minimize French casualties, French civilian casualties, by hitting German troop concentrations, transportation targets, bridges. The other plan didn't worry so much about French civilian casualties and included dozens of communication centers across Normandy, including many, many post offices. French losses would have been even more enormous than they were from conventional bombs, artillery, and bullets. Well, when that conference occurred at St. Paul's School on May 15th, American soldiers by the tens of thousands are pouring into Britain every week. Since January, the number of GIs there had doubled to 1.5 million. It's a country the size of Oregon. Of the U.S. Army's 89 divisions, 20 could now be found in the United Kingdom, with 37 more either en route or earmarked for the European theater. They came through Liverpool, through Swansea, Cardiff, Belfast, but most came into Glasgow and adjacent Greenock. More than 100,000 in April 1944 alone. 15,000 at a time arrived on the 2 Queens, Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, ships that could haul an entire division apiece and outrun German U-boats to make the crossing over the Atlantic in 5 days. And once reaching the British Isles, the troops are farmed out to 1,200 camps and 133 airfields. Almost none of them know where they're going, of course, beyond England, and they refer to their destination simply as, and somewhat ominously, as the far shore. Well, we, of course, know where they were headed. And one of the reasons that we know as much as we do about what happened at Normandy on June 6, 1944, and one of the reasons that the titanic struggle that took place there still exerts such a strong hold on our imaginations and on our hearts is because of Cornelius Ryan. His friend, Herb Cain, who was a prominent newspaper columnist in San Francisco, called Ryan the man who invented D-Day. Ryan recognized not only the tremendous narrative power of what happened there and on subsequent battlefields in Western Europe, but he also accepted the need, responsibility to memorialize those who fought across those fields. In some measure, he's a reason why, 75 years later, we're still talking about it with fervor and amazement. Few modern writers have been more enduring, and none had greater commercial success, selling millions of books in 24 languages with titles that became part of the vocabulary of the Second World War, notably The Longest Day and A Bridge Too Far, both of which are included in this new Library of America anthology. Like Bruce Caton and Barbara Tuchman, Ryan demonstrated that creditable, rigorous history could be written for a wide audience by non-academic historians. His battle books harnessed the skills that he had learned as a young journalist, particularly as an interviewer and a collator of information. He used also techniques often associated with fiction, dialogue, interior monologue, the accretion of minute detail, and rapid cinematic cutting from scene to scene. He was a master of suspense, even when writing about events we all know about, and that is a gift. He knew that in the best narrative writing, as David McCullough has observed, there is no such thing as a foreseeable future. For those of us of a later generation who have written narrative histories of World War II, his enormous influence is enduring and will endure. And I'd like to tell you a bit more about him. He was born in Dublin in 1920, educated by the Christian Brothers in Sing Street. While studying violin at the Irish Academy of Music, he also learned to tap dance and later formed his own dance band, the High-Low Orchestra, to play at country inns and tennis clubs. At 17, by his own account, quote, a particularly obnoxious and I suppose insufferable know-it-all, Ryan wrote 2 sonatas, 2 plays, 4 short stories, and a 1-hour radio documentary intended for the BBC. In 1940, he moved to London, working as a management trainee in a Battersea biscuit factory and helping to feed thousands who took refuge every night in air raid shelters during the Blitz. The Reuters news agency hired Ryan as a copy boy, but he soon moved to the Daily Telegraph as a reporter covering the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces, both of them flying missions out of England against targets on the continent. On D-Day, a day after turning 24, he flew twice with B-26 bombers supporting the Allied invasion. The first flight aborted with mechanical problems 5 miles short of the French coast. Returning to England, Ryan boarded another plane that attacked enemy targets just beyond the beaches. In subsequent weeks, he flew several times with squadrons trying to prevent German panzer reinforcements from reaching the beachhead. He subsequently joined the ground troops as the Allies bludgeoned their way out of Normandy, covering the U.S. First Army and then Patton's Third Army in the race across France. As the war edged into Germany, his dispatches grew sharper in focus and in tone. In a Rhineland village, he reported that surrendering civilians, quote, will invariably tell you that they hate Hitler and that it was all a terrible mistake. At the liberated concentration camp in Ohrdruf, he described murdered inmates sprinkled with quicklime, and he recounted how they've been flogged to death, shot, tortured, and maltreated. As Patton's legions barreled into Czechoslovakia, Ryan wrote of a German general who shot himself in the head after signing the surrender documents in Pilsen. Ryan writes, quote, his wife stepped forward and wiped the blood from the general's face. After the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, Ryan made his way to the Pacific, arriving in Japan shortly after the final capitulation and reporting on the aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Perhaps his finest dispatch, and among the war's most vivid, came after he accompanied American officers in Tokyo on September 11th, 1945, as they arrested Tojo Hideki, Japan's bellicose prime minister from 1941 to 1944. Ryan was standing a few feet from Tojo when he shot himself in the chest but missed his heart. In a story datelined "By Tojo's Bedside," included in this anthology, he wrote, quote, "Blood seeped across his shirt to his breeches. It seeped through the upholstery of the chair in which he was slumped and was gathering underneath in a large spreading pool." Spangled with detail, the account described Tojo's costume: white shirt, gray-blue military riding breeches, and brown riding boots. His cigarette brand, Hope, with "Finest Virginian" printed on the label. And various melodramatic utterances, including, quote, "Let MacArthur have my corpse, I wait for the righteous judgment of history." Periodically checking Tojo's pulse, Ryan scribbled notes in the room for nearly 3 hours until an American ambulance finally hauled the bleeding man to a hospital. The Daily Telegraph proudly noted that Ryan's dispatch had cost more than £250, $1,000, to cable to London at urgent rates, making it probably the most expensive newspaper message of the war. As for Tojo, he recovered from his wounds to be hanged as a war criminal in December 1948. Ryan later reported from Jerusalem, covering the conflict between British troops and the Jewish underground before moving here to New York in 1950. He worked briefly for Time, Life, and then for Newsweek. In 1950, he married Catherine Ann Morgan, an Iowa-born editor for Condé Nast Publications, and he became an American citizen. Later that year, Collier's magazine hired him to write long expository pieces on subjects as varied as nuclear war and auto racing. "Remember," quoting him, "remember that stupidity is your greatest asset," he later told aspiring journalists. "Don't be afraid to say that I don't understand." In composing a first draft, he also advised, "Start off with these 2 words, Dear Mother," as though you're writing a letter home. It's amazing how it works. At times, his enthusiasms got the better of him, as in his vigorous promotion of the space flight ambitions of Wernher von Braun, former SS officer, Nazi Party member, and an aerospace engineer whose V-2 rockets had killed thousands of civilians on behalf of the Third Reich. A movie based on von Braun's life, I Aim at the Stars, inspired one wit to propose a caustic subtitle, But Sometimes I Hit London. As the German expatriate became a central figure in the American space program, Ryan served as his ghostwriter and, by his account, von Braun's right-arm bag carrier and, above all, friend. But he wrote some fine, long-form narratives for Collier's. After the collision of 2 ocean liners off Nantucket in July 1956, which caused the sinking of the SS Andrea Doria, Ryan visited the lost vessel's sister ship for a precise sense of place, leading him to assert, for example, that 75 steps led from the promenade deck to the bridge, 3 levels up. He interviewed survivors, amassed a 150,000-word research file, constructed a detailed chronology of the fatal voyage, then booked a room in the Waldorf Astoria, and in 5 days wrote a narrative focused on cabin number 56, where a doomed passenger from the Andrea Doria had been trapped by debris. Collier's reportedly sold 1 million extra copies of that issue. His approach certainly owed something to Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, a 1955 bestseller about the sinking of the Titanic, but the writer Theodore H. Dwight would observe that Ryan was experimenting with, quote, a different style of narrative, the episode-by-episode recreation of large events. And then the magazine abruptly folded in late 1956. Ryan took assignments for McCall's, Sports Illustrated, and the Saturday Evening Post. For some years, he'd been thinking about June 6, 1944, as a book. Quote, I see this as a carefully documented human narrative concerned only with ordinary people caught up in fear and crisis, he wrote. Catherine, his wife, agreed to support him and their 2 children as he began to research D-Day. He sought veterans by placing advertisements in magazines, newspapers, even Army camp bulletins. "Were you there on 6 June 1944? One of those queries asked. To those who replied, he sent 3 pages of detailed questions, including, "Were you wounded?" and "In times of great crisis, people generally show great ingenuity or self-reliance. Others do incredibly stupid things." Do you remember any examples of either? As he accumulated more than 1,000 questionnaires, Ryan and his assistants interviewed several hundred respondents and other witnesses in the United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, and France. On 1,200 index cards, he constructed a chronology of the Allied landings hour by hour and then minute by minute. General Maxwell D. Taylor, a combat commander in Normandy who by this time had become the U.S. Army's chief of staff, authorized his use of previously classified German war diaries, as well as Allied after-action reports down to company level. Reader's Digest agreed to underwrite his research in exchange for serial rights. But at times he despaired at the jumbled heap of information he collected. "I do not know how I'm going to do this right now," he told Catherine. To an editor at Simon & Schuster, which contracted to publish his book, he wrote, Max quoted this, "I'm doing my best to abide by a single rule of thumb, accuracy. The men who died on both sides on D-Day deserve that much." Well, as a war correspondent, he had helped to compose the first rough draft of history. Now, as a military historian, he'd lengthened and widened his lens to write a more enduring account. 15 years had passed since D-Day, allowing enough perspective to be comprehensive and veracious, telling the story from all sides, like a cyclorama, while also shifting his vantage from high to low, from headquarters, war rooms, to landing craft under fire. All those questionnaires and reports could hardly scratch the surface of the stupendous documentation accumulated during the war. By one estimate, the U.S. Army's records alone from World War II weigh 17,000 tons. Moreover, Ryan would write each of his battle books before the greatest secret of the war became public in 1974, with the disclosure of Ultra, the extraordinary British ability to intercept and decode many secret German military messages. He confessed to, quote, cold fear when the research for a book was finished. The subject material has always seemed greater than my ability to handle it. That sounds familiar. That diffidence notwithstanding, The Longest Day, in less than 300 pages, told a story both panoramic and intimate. "Never had there been a dawn like this," he wrote of June 6th, "and never had there been a World War II history quite like this. A book that opened and closed with the reader at the elbow of the senior German commander in Normandy, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And between appearances by Rommel, General Eisenhower, and a few other senior officers, the invasion was seen through the previously anonymous soldiers and civilians that Ryan called his kings. Bash on, a British sergeant off Sword Beach roars at his driver, but perhaps also at Ryan. The narrative pace is headlong, with some chapters as short as 3 paragraphs, and the final few pages shifting scenes more than a dozen times. Ryan once declared, quote, "I am not actually writing about war. I use it only as a framework. I'm writing about the human spirit in the midst of war. Incredible courage, loyalty, hope, despair, and all too often ineptitude and bad management." Indeed, his great theme is the struggle for courage before and during combat. Yet he never suggests that valor is commonplace. And he does not write victor's history. Allied soldiers die from the folly and miscalculation of their leaders, as well as from German bullets. And he never took a reader's indulgence for granted. Quote, "I need a cracklingly crisp first sentence that makes the reader want to go on to the next one," he explained. "And by the end of the first paragraph, I've got to hook my reader or I am lost, and worse, I will have lost him." Well, published in 1959, The Longest Day proved an enormous success. Translations appeared in 23 languages, including Afrikaans, Hungarian, and Turkish. Not everyone was charmed. Drew Middleton, military affairs correspondent for the New York Times, called it, quote, "The Fifi Dupont was washing her drawers when the American tanks arrived style of military history," in which trifling details obscured larger themes. Nonetheless, Ryan estimated that eventually he received at least 20,000 fan letters from readers, including one from the daughter of a D-Day casualty. And it reads like this: "I'm 27 and never knew my father. He was killed on Omaha Beach. Reading The Longest Day," she added, "dispelled the resentment she felt at his absence. I cried because I love him, and he might have loved me. I cried too because his life was over before mine ever really began. Yet he gave me my life. Thank you for giving me my father after all these years." Time magazine reported that at John F. Kennedy's inauguration on January 20, 1961, the new president found common ground with Eisenhower, his predecessor, in an animated private discussion of The Longest Day. Ryan also wrote the screenplay that young Max saw, 1962 film version, a 3-hour movie produced by Darrell F. Zanuck. Quote, "One of the last of the great vulgarians," Ryan complained, and starring John Wayne, Henry Fonda, Robert Mitchum, Richard Burton, and it goes on and on. When the film premiered in Paris, 50 French Army tanks rolled past the theater, fireworks erupted near the Eiffel Tower, and the chanteuse Edith Piaf sang in celebration. Ryan intended to write a pentalogy, 5 volumes about the European theater in 1944-45. Rather than marching chronologically through those campaigns, he jumped to the end of the war for his next book, The Last Battle, about the fall of Berlin. Again, with help from Reader's Digest, he conducted research in Moscow, and he confirmed mass rapes by marauding Soviet troops in Germany. That book was a bestseller in 1966 and translated into Arabic, Icelandic, and 21 other languages. Ryan then launched his most ambitious battle project yet, the story of a star-crossed Allied attempt in September 1944 to outflank German defenses on the Rhine by capturing Arnhem, a Dutch riverine town, with both an overland assault from Belgium and the largest airborne operation of World War II. By now, the war had Ryan in an iron grip. He told Herb Caen, his columnist friend, "I have no less than 7,000 books on every aspect of World War II. My maps alone could wallpaper at least 2 houses. You may think this is all a kind of madness, an obsession." For the new book, provisionally titled The Big Drop, he again placed advertisements, collected questionnaires, interviewed hundreds of participants, and constructed a chronology of Operation Market Garden, so granular that it filled, by his reckoning, 7 or 8 file cabinets. Yet months passed, and then years, with little progress on the manuscript. Ryan let himself be distracted with speeches, lectures, screenplays, interviews, and a surprise 50th birthday party in June 1970, right around the corner here, attended by journalist luminaries like Walter Cronkite and Art Buchwald, as well as by General Omar Bradley. He admitted making 200 false starts on his book, and by August 1971 had written only 47 pages. In truth, he was sick, mortally sick. with metastatic prostate cancer, diagnosed shortly after that birthday extravaganza. Between fitful work on the book, now retitled A Bridge Too Far, he shuttled between oncologists in search of a cure or at least palliative treatment. Quote, "The last 3 years have been very, very tough," he wrote Herb Caen in June 1973. "My working hours have been cut down to almost 2 or 3 a day. I'm 3 years late with it, and the publishers are screaming. The advances have been spent, and we're trying to keep our heads above water." In a display of fortitude worthy of his kings, Ryan wrote the final 356 pages in 5 months, more than he had written in the previous 3 years. By that time, cancer had spread to his shoulder, hip, and knee. Published in September 1974, the book would spend 19 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It was translated into 19 languages. A subsequent movie directed by Richard Attenborough featured James Caan, Michael Caine, Sean Connery, and Laurence Olivier. Henry Steele Comander, among the most prolific and celebrated American intellectuals, described Ryan, quote, as one of the great amateur historians. That doesn't mean, this is quoting Comander, that doesn't mean he's not professional in his skills and techniques. He's amateur in the sense that he has not been taken in by the Academy. Also sounds familiar. After his death on November 23rd, 1974, Catherine discovered that for more than 4 years, her husband had secretly kept a detailed chronicle of his illness and the effort to finish his last work. She combined that material with her own extensive diary to write a private battle, a searing account of their joint struggle. Veterans from the 82nd Airborne Division formed an honor guard at Ryan's funeral in Connecticut. Mourners included retired Lieutenant General James M. Gavin, who as a young officer had parachuted into Normandy on June 6th and into Holland on September 17th, 1944. Another veteran paratrooper recited the division's burial service for a fallen comrade. Cronkite read from The Longest Day, and a boys' choir sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The man who, to the end, had never seen myself as a writer, but only as a journalist, quote unquote, was lowered into his grave with a headstone that included only his name, the dates bracketing his life, and a single descriptive epitaph, reporter. Although he only lived long enough to complete 3 of the 5 books he hoped to write, he still succeeded in writing about history's most terrible bloodletting in a way that attracted a following as vast as the armies he helped to immortalize. Osmer White, an Australian journalist who had also covered the Third Army in Europe, wrote, "The living have the cause of the dead in trust." So long as he lived, Ryan kept that trust, and he keeps it still. Thanks very much for having me here tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll take questions for as long as you've got questions. Sir.
Thank you.
Oh, hang on a minute. She's bringing you a microphone.
Thank you for a very vivid story of a very great reporter, as you said. A question relevant to our present times. What was Ryan's own recorded or spoken attitude towards America? He was born in Ireland, became an American citizen, and remained for a good part of that life, married an American. Did he leave any notes or evidence because he was an immigrant?
Yeah. Well, he wouldn't get in today, would he? Well, to my knowledge, he never answer that question directly, but he certainly answers it indirectly and in a way that I can, with confidence, summarize. He was a proud American. He was a proud immigrant. He was proud to be Irish, too, and he would go home and visit his family in Dublin periodically. But there's no doubt that the affection he had developed for Americans in the war, in the battle zone, transported him here to start with and carried him through the rest of his life. He saw the glory of the country and the glory of its people, as a way sometimes that only immigrants can see clearly. He had met a man in the war who subsequently became associate dean and administrator of some sort at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And Ryan was convinced to leave his papers, which are extensive, including all those interviews that I referred to Ohio University. He didn't send his stuff back to Dublin. He was here to stay. I have to say it's a brilliant collection. It's absolutely an extraordinary documentary record because they're transcripts of all the interviews that he did, not in real time, but very close to real time with everyone from the senior generals down to the lowest privates. And I think that bespeaks the affection that he felt for the country. He wanted his bequest to be left here as part of this relationship that he had developed with his adopted country. Yes, sir. Hang on a second. She's there with the microphone next to you.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether he ever wrote or expressed his opinion about the wars in Vietnam and Korea before his death.
I'm sure he expressed his opinion because he was opinionated about everything. He considered, it's interesting that even though he had committed himself to this, what he'd hoped was a pentology on the war, after he finished the second volume about the fall of Berlin, he looked at other subjects. And one of the things that he was considering then were looking at other wars. So he looked at Korea. He was he was interested in Vietnam. That's clear from some of his correspondence and what we were getting ourselves into. He was friends with John Kennedy, just two old Irishmen sitting around. And Kennedy had greased the skids for him to get to Moscow. When Kennedy went to Vienna and for his infamous conference with Khrushchev, Kennedy petitioned on Ryan's behalf to have Ryan be permitted to come into the Soviet archives and to interview senior Soviet commanders. And Khrushchev acceded to that request. And so Ryan clearly had an interest in current events. He was he's an old newspaper hack. And, he remained very current on events worldwide. But World War II kept drawing him back, partly because it was a great way to feed the bulldog. I mean, he was making money hand over fist, and he wasn't going to make that kind of money writing about Korea. I don't know that he ever got to the point of thinking about it more than just thinking about it, but he certainly considered other topics. In the back there, sir.
I'm asking a question about the quality of his research on the German side. Did he have the ability to read German?
He did not. He didn't have to. He had Reader's Digest reading it for him. Now, I say that a little flippantly, but I referred to the German documents that were declassified specifically for Ryan, and I've been through, there's hundreds of them. As the war ended and German senior officers are being arrested, the ones who aren't killing themselves or being killed are being arrested and put in jail, and they often have years. Albert Kesselring is a good example. He'd been the senior German commander in the Mediterranean, very, very competent general to our woe. First in North Africa and then in Italy, and then he became German commander on the Western Front. Kesselring was arrested in May 1945, spent, I think, 5 years in prison, and like many of his colleagues, had lots of time on his hand and was encouraged to write essentially memoirs, monographs, and they're extraordinarily valuable. Now, you remember who's writing it, so it was never my fault, it was Hitler's fault, Hitler made me do it, but allowing for that kind of skew, there's a lot of detail. And the Army, the US Army in particular, is collecting this stuff in part to learn how to fight the Russians. This is, as the Cold War is starting, there's great interest in what the Germans did and did not do in fighting the Russians. So these monographs, they're all at the National Archives, and they were translated in most cases, certainly many cases, into English, real time, for the precise reason that you want your strategists to be able to read them when thinking about how to fight the Russians. And those were available to Ryan. And then again, Reader's Digest is providing him with enormous logistical support. So, he didn't read or speak Russian, but when he goes to Russia, first of all, Reader's Digest paid for one of the great scholars of the Soviet Union, John Erickson, from the University of Edinburgh, to go with him as his translator. And Erickson wrote 2 of the towering books about the Red Army, The Road to Stalingrad and The Road to Berlin. And so this is Ryan's wingman. So he's got that kind of support. Now, I mentioned the fact that he was unaware, or he certainly didn't write about it if he was aware about Ultra, the great secret of being able to intercept and decrypt German radio transmissions. There were lots of other things that he didn't have access to because things have come out since he was writing at that time. Material still comes out about World War II. So he doesn't have everything. And he did not have, for example, the German official histories available to him. They've been published by Oxford University Press. I think they're 10 volumes now. They're big doorstops. And he didn't have that kind of material available to him. So you work with what you've got at the time. Sir, hang on just a second. Here she comes.
So what was the connection between Ryan and DeWitt Wallace and the Reader's Digest? How'd that work?
The connection between Ryan and Reader's Digest was he had persuaded them that they were going to make money off of the serial rights to The Longest Day. Serial rights, yeah. And they did get the serial rights to it. Whether they made money or not, I assume they made money on it. And it was the beginning of a relationship that persisted through the other books that he did. They get first serial, they meaning the magazine gets first serial, and in exchange for that, they helped to underwrite his research. Those were the days. That doesn't happen anymore. Sir, hang on, she's coming.
What was the connection, if any, between him and Stephen Ambrose and the research that Ambrose did about the landing?
Yeah, they hated each other.
A lot of people hated Ambrose, I think.
Yeah, well, Ryan had a special antipathy toward him. Ambrose was a scholar, PhD, University of Wisconsin, and was working on the Eisenhower papers for Johns Hopkins University Press. And Ambrose was a real academic historian, regardless of his later success as a popular historian. And when Ryan's book about the fall of Berlin came out, Ambrose wrote a scathing review for some academic press. It was not for the Times Book Review. It was a fairly obscure place, but it was scathing and it was legitimate because Ryan had criticized Eisenhower Eisenhower's decision-making about whether or not to try to beat the Russians to Berlin. This is in the spring of 1945. It's a story I know very, very well. And Ryan just has it wrong. And Ambrose, who never knew how to soft pedal his opinions, just tore into him. And so there's correspondence from the Ryan papers at Ohio University about this vitriol back and forth between the two of them. And it's pretty vitriolic. Now, when Eisenhower read Ryan's account, this is quoted in my introductory essay, and I'm misquoting myself, but Eisenhower's response was basically, how could the writer be so stupid? It's a little harsh, but Ambrose is defending Eisenhower. Ambrose is, I think, defending the historical record. Ambrose outlived him by a lot. Ambrose went on to be, as popular, certainly in terms of book sales, as Ryan was. Probably not quite as many millions, but in the millions. And, was the founding father of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. By this point, Ambrose has pissed off a series of academic institutions, ends up at the University of New Orleans, and that's why the museum is down there. I sent the correspondence that I'm referring to about this antipathy between the two of them to Nick Mueller, who's he was Ambrose's best friend. He was a history PhD at the University of New Orleans and became the CEO of the museum in New Orleans. And Nick had not, even though he and Ambrose were closest friends for many years, he had not known about this. And Nick replied to me after reading this, "Yeah, that sounds like Steve." Over here, yes, sir. Hang on, she's right behind you.
Just to follow up on that, and in your own case as a popular historian, and the relationship between popular history and academic historians. I mean, if you read the American Historical Review, those type of articles and what people love to read about, it seems there's such a disconnect there. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on it. Are there any academic historians in the audience here? Well, what has happened to some extent, I think, this is my theory and it's shared by others. Academic historians have, first of all, university history departments and deanships were taken over by what the Germans call the 68ers. People who often, and I'm generalizing terribly, but people often had an antipathy to military history, believing, in fact, that if you're interested in military history, if you write military history, you must like war. And so it became, and is to some extent still, almost impossible to get tenure at an American university as a military historian. There are a few exceptions. Ohio State, Texas A&M, military academies, but they're rare. And the good programs that once existed, Yale, Duke, I don't think they have any military historians in their history faculties now. So part of what happened was that others, often former journalists like me, Max Hastings, Barbara Tuchman, there are others, stepped into the breach, recognizing, first of all, that there was an appetite for it, and have filled that breach as popular military historians. I'm told by my friends in the academy that this is changing slightly, perhaps as the 68ers are retiring, I don't know. and that there is at least an impulse because classes that are offered on war, whether it's a class on Vietnam or a class on World War II or whatever, they're always oversubscribed. Students are interested in it. And they're not interested in it because they like war. They're interested in it because they know it's our history. And so there may be a shift back slightly in favor of believing that there's a room in the Academy for military historians, the Academy broadly rather than in those hot spots that I mentioned. So I think that's part of the dynamic that was at play. It was certainly for Ambrose. You know, Ambrose, who'd been an academic and kind of got run out of the Academy, or ran himself out of the Academy, recognized that there was room to write popular military history. Now, he had his own issues. He turned into a little book factory and was cranking out whatever it was, 10 books in 6 years, or 6 books in 10 years, or something like that. And toward the end of his life, he died prematurely also because he was a heavy smoker, but the books got sloppy. And you know, I don't think Simon & Schuster was unhappy to have him provide a title every year or so, but the meticulous care that he had taken earlier slipped a bit. So there's an interesting dynamic at play in this. And you know, I find that academic historians now, again, because there's some really fine ones. Gerhard Weinberg, for example, is now emeritus at Chapel Hill, probably the best single volume on World War II, A World at Arms. Gerhard emigrated to the US before World War II. He's now well into his 80s. And that's a very fine, it's a doorstop, but it's a very fine book. Alan Millett, who was at Ohio State for many years, now lives in New Orleans, also very fine academic historian who writes readable books. But you know, frequently, academic historians generally feel that, as is the way of the Academy these days, you got to slice the salami a little thinner so that you've got your own little piece of salami that you can talk about to the 200 people who are going to buy your book. And that's unfortunate, because these are people who, you know, they're trained to go into the archives, to really burrow into a subject. But you got to do more than write about a little piece of salami. It's got to be a bigger chunk of salami. Yeah. Okay. All right. Sir.
Just answer my question.
Max tells me, I just answered your question?
Well, I was curious about your definition of academic versus non-academic historian. That's the last two questions.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll get another one. Any others? All right, we're done. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. That was terrific, Rick. This evening is part of the Library of America Fellows Program. Fellows events include private tours, literary salons and private homes, intimate conversations with distinguished historians, film sneak previews, and many other kinds of events. Fellows and members support our core publishing mission and also much more, our outreach into the community. I want to say that the last Fellows event for this season is on June 11th. It's a private tour of the Morgan Library's Walt Whitman Bicentennial Show, conducted by the curator Ted Widmer. And Ted, who's a great friend of Library of America and a terrific historian and raconteur, you shouldn't miss that. I just want to mention just a couple of the community projects that Fellows help to support. In the past year, inspired in part by the kids in Parkland, high school students around the country have rediscovered a commitment and passion for American democracy and its civic possibilities. To support this new spirit, our Library of America in the Classroom initiative provided America's greatest political speeches free of charge to classrooms and teachers in all 50 states. And we're following up right now with Reporting World War II, which includes reading which resonates very powerfully for some of the reasons that Rick talked about tonight. Looking ahead to 2020, Library of America and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture are partnering on a national public humanities initiative entitled Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters, a project that comprises a book, live events, digital resources, and includes partnerships with the Academy of American Poets, the National Book Foundation, and public libraries and bookstores around the country. So just to give you a sense, I mean, what fellows give is the opportunity to do things like that, as well as support our mission. What you get are terrific events like tonight's talk by Rick. If you believe in Library of America's mission and would like to support our activities in a more substantial way, nothing is more helpful than endowing a volume in the series or providing publication support for a future volume. Either way, the book stands as a permanent testimony to your gift. And I just want to say, if you want to know more, there are three guardians in the audience tonight, Mary Patton, Elihu Rose, and Nancy Edwards. If you're curious, talk to them, or talk to me, or talk to Caroline Horn, my colleague. Thanks again to Rick Atkinson for a terrific talk, and thank you very, very much for coming.